Well, welcome back, everyone. One of the things that John loved about this event was the ability to discuss the events of the day, but another thing that he was very fond of was addressing events that are coming at us, sort of previews of coming attractions. And a very significant attraction that is coming all of our way is carbon border adjustment. So I'm delighted to have this panel. We have the representative to the EU Parliament from Holland, who is the rapporteur for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the much beloved CBAM. So Dr. Chahim is smack in the middle of the EU's development of the CBAM. And my friend Bill Cassidy represents Louisiana. And Louisiana is a real crucible on climate because it's a very strong fossil fuel economy, and at the same time, it's also the state that is losing more territory to the ocean from sea level rise than all other states. So, and he's the author of a carbon border adjustment proposal. And just a quick framing of why a carbon border adjustment matters. If we're going to move to a clean energy economy, we have to offset the enormous subsidy that fossil fuel enjoys, which the International Monetary Fund has pegged in the trillions, $600 billion in the US alone. So if you're going to offset that with a price on carbon, with cap and trade, with other mechanisms, you create opportunities for cheating, for what they call leakage, and the carbon border adjustment protects the industries and the economies of the countries that are moving forward and being responsible against cheaters who are taking advantage of a lower price from failing to play along. So there's some bipartisan conversation about this in the Senate, and we have action coming our way. And let me start by asking both Minister Chahim and Senator Cassidy just a quick response on why they're interested in carbon border adjustment. Mohammed.
First of all, thanks for having me. I'm quite excited being here. Thanks also to the McCain Institute for organizing this event. I mean, I'm a big fan of carbon border adjustment mechanism, but the reason why is that I think in the EU and in the US, there has been a lot of policies in place to help our industry decarbonize, to become more efficient. And at some point, the level playing field with third countries, let's say producers from China, is not, I mean, the competition is a bit unfair. So what we do is to make sure that there's an incentive to also decarbonize when you're not producing in the US or in the EU. We have this correction mechanism at the border. So it's a quite market-driven mechanism that I think works really well. And also, I mean, it creates a level playing field. That's the main reason I think we should do it. And the final thing is, I mean, whether you pollute or whether you emit CO2 in China or in the Netherlands or in the US, it ends up in one world, in one Earth that we have. So we need to make sure that when we want to meet the Paris Agreement and the Paris goals, we have to make sure that every producer in the world, wherever they produce, need to follow our standards that we set, and hopefully we set between us, Americans and the European Union.
And Bill, your carbon border adjustment and reset, what's the logic that you bring to that?
Yeah. In the spirit of this conference, a carbon border adjustment is a geopolitical tool that allows us to address the threat posed to us by China and others. Paul Kennedy wrote a book in 1988 in which he describes the nexus between energy use, economic growth, and the ability to fund a military. Now we would add a fourth component: energy, economic growth, military, and emissions as a fourth component of that nexus. Now, China is a clear example of this. In 2005, the US and the EU began to lower emissions by cap and trade and regulations, respectively. China ignored emissions, and there was a rationale for it. It cost money to enforce environmental regulations. Now, by not enforcing these regulations and using coal as a cheap form of energy, they lowered the cost of manufacturing in China incenting industry and foreign direct investment to pour into China. So, real life example, real life. An American CFO told me that his company invested in China because China did not require them to turn on their SOx and NOx scrubbers. So their return on investment is 18% versus 9% that would have resulted if they had built the plant in the US. As Ambassador Tai said yesterday, investors demand return. And so industry has moved to China. So much so that in the early 2000s, they were 19th and 20th in emissions and manufacturing, and now they are first in both. And the decrease in emissions that the EU and the US have achieved, if you put them together, they are less than the increase in emissions in China. Okay, EU, US decrease, put them together, it is still less than the increase that has resulted in Chinese emissions. Now, meanwhile, their GDP has gone from a distant sixth to second in the world, approaching that of ours. So going back to Paul Kennedy, the increased GDP has clearly funded their increase in military budget. Developing countries noticed, by the way, they are competing with China. They also ignore emissions in order to lower their cost of manufacturing and to attract foreign direct investment. We got to flip this. We got to flip this from where you ignore emissions and your economy grows to where you pay attention to emissions and your economy grows. A WTO-compliant carbon border adjustment does this. It's a clear standard. It can't be kind of a loophole that you get around. It's not defeated by a promise that you would make, that say China would make, that China later ignores. I would make the point that a carbon border adjustment is a better, cheaper geopolitical tool than war. And
Mohammed, you are doing this in the EU. You're in the middle of all of that. Give us a preview of how soon border adjustments will start to be imposed on US-EU trade, and what's the schedule going forward, and how certain are you about it?
So I first wanted to applaud for your input. I mean, I think it's a very important thing. And I sit here between a Democrat and a Republican, and I feel really comfortable because I do believe that this
but
is
he's closer to me.
No, I mean, I think this is a topic, I mean, in the spirit of John McCain, to do this bipartisan. I think it's very important to see what unites us and get us forward, not only within the US, but especially looking at trade relations. I think trade should not be only about, exchanging products. It's also about who do you trade with and what are the conditions that we want to uphold those people. Economically, socially, environmentally, the rule of law. I think these things are becoming more and more important. And then your question, I want to give a very clear message. The carbon border adjustment in the EU will be there. Let's say, I expect that we will introduce it by 2023, where we'll have a 2 or 3 period of data analysis to see how it will look like in practice, and then probably in 2025 or 2026, it will be implemented. And so we will go forward. And we're not the only country or region in the world that goes forward with this. The Canadians are working on it, and there are some other countries. And we would love in the US also to join us to make sure that we set these standards internationally, that we set a new front, a new requirement when it comes to carbon, and that whether you pollute, you have to pay for that pollution. Because the problem with pollution is if CO2, the carbon, is emitted in China, it affects us here as well. And I think that we should stop that. And the CBAM is a very elegant mechanism to get us there.
So as the CBAM goes into effect, if you look at its effect bilaterally between the United States and the EU, if we have done nothing, then American industries covered by the CBAM will start to have to make tariff payments to make up for the fact that we have not made progress. And in the bilateral context, that puts us at a disadvantage.
Yes.
But as you've pointed out, this is not a bilateral agreement. This is the EU imposing it on all its trading partners around the world. What can the US assuming we don't do anything, talk about the effect on U.S. trade with the EU on a bilateral basis, but then what happens when you factor in the multilateral effect of the CBAM on China, on India, and on other traders, and what then that does to the EU-U.S. trade relationship?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of conversations with senators, members of the House, people from the administration, and the first reaction of CBAM, the European measure, is, I mean, this puts us, we need to start paying a price to trade with Europeans. And I understand this first reaction. But if you go a bit further and know that production in the EU, in the US and also in the EU are much more cleaner than many other countries, I think if we compare carbon emissions in the US with China, it's 1-3. With India, it's even 1-6, which means that if you look at the overall trade effect between the EU and the US, I can see that maybe it even will improve. Why? Very simple. The fee that you need to pay for the carbon, and by the way, our producers need to pay that as well. It's not something that we put only on American producers, also on European producers. It's much lower than what the Chinese or any other country needs to start paying, which means that the European market will be much more accessible for American producers. What about, I mean, I don't think you can get a better level playing field than this.
So, assuming no real change, it's likely that the cost on American industry of complying with the EU tariffs and making those payments will be, to some degree, and perhaps even to a much greater degree than the cost, offset by a remigration to the US because of the rebalancing against China and India, because we are much more.
Yes.
And Bill, you've written about the relative carbon intensity of the US compared to China and India. We do pretty well.
We do really well. And I think the point to make here is, let me just emphasize the point that they were making. By the way, Sheldon mentioned what we've done. On my website, cassidy.senate.gov/reset is the proposal that we've put forward. But the EU and the US have already invested in this. That's the point. We have spent the money to decarbonize many of our products. The United States has the additional advantage of using natural gas instead of coal. And natural gas is that, you know, the carbon intensity per unit of energy for natural gas is about 50% that of coal. So if we're using that as feedstock for our chemicals, if we're using that as a way to power the processes, we are inherently lower now than our competitors who, as I mentioned, don't turn on their scrubbers in order to take the SOx and NOx from an energy grid which gets 60% of their energy from coal. So we are so much better off than they. We should take advantage of everything we've already done in order to level the playing field.
And you've got, I mean, you're at the center of the heart of the climate conflict because you have an enormous fossil fuel industry in Louisiana, and you also have fishermen, sportsmen's paradise, vacationers, beaches, a coastal economy that is taking it pretty hard. How do you balance the politics of that, and how is the proposal you've made for carbon border adjustment playing into how this is viewed at home? Because you're kind of a microcosm of the larger battle we have.
So let's broaden this discussion. And I'm going to echo some of the things Ambassador Tai said yesterday. One of her quotes is that if you ignore the issue of forced labor, your competitiveness suffers vis-a-vis the country that uses forced labor. Now, I would say that if we ignore the fact that developing countries are incentivized to emit, then we are going to hurt our competitiveness. When everything I just described, by the way, where China ignoring environmental standards to lower cost of emissions and manufacturing attracted industry, that came from the US and the EU.
Yes.
In the US, it's estimated by a group out of MIT that we lost somewhere about 1 million manufacturing jobs and 2.4 million jobs overall in this process which I described. I go to my folks and I say, this is geopolitical. This is a way to make us safer vis-a-vis international competitors such as the Chinese. It is a way to reshore industry. Those million of jobs we lost, we won't get them all back. There's been a lot of efficiency gains from other things, but we will get a lot of them back. And so it's a way to create middle-class prosperity for folks who've really been hurting. It's also, by a way, in my state, to begin to do something significant to lower global emissions, which maybe helps me not lose as much coastline. And lastly, it links us with the EU in an economic, environmental, and military partnership that allows us to better offset, pick Russia, pick the Chinese, or pick to any other competitor. We now have a consuming bloc, which is probably, I don't know, 3/4 of the world's economy. The amount of consumption that takes place between the EU and the US becomes an economic driver for the developing world to lower their emissions, not to increase them.
So Mohammed, you're going to be looking at a lot of other countries that are not in compliance with the EU's program and trying to assess trades. There are a variety of different ways in which countries can try to comply. I'm from Rhode Island. We have RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a small, local price on carbon, and it has worked very well. You have your EU emissions trading mechanism, which is very robust and reaches across all of the countries. The private sector, very often major companies have built a price on carbon into their internal decision-making in order to guide the right decisions. And at some point, the Biden administration will renew the social cost of carbon and update it. So there are all these different ways in which these pressures can be brought to bear. Are there ways to make sure that those are all recognized in our negotiations with the EU over what the tariff should be? How do we get credit for upping our game?
Yeah, so I think you get credit by, of course, I mean, all this implicit carbon pricing policies, you would say, or non-pricing mechanisms. I mean, they result in producing more efficiently, which gives you an advantage compared to your competitors. I mean, if you produce more efficiently, that's better for your production process. I mean, at the end of the day, if we want to start comparing the pricing on carbon, whether it's implicit or explicit, I know that the OECD is working on that. It's a very complicated world. We say it's comparing apples and oranges. I mean, we say apples and pears, but I think, I don't know if everyone would understand that, but here it's apples and the oranges. It becomes a bit difficult. So that's why we say, I mean, every explicit price, whether it's local, regional, or on state level, or on a federal level, will be included will be deducted from the price that you need to pay at the border. We will also monitor very closely whether there's no circumvention with like subsidies or any other, let's say, government support that, you know, they create this fake CO2 market where companies pay, but at the end they just get the money back. I mean, this is something we really monitor. But what we've seen in the beginning, before CBAM becomes reality in the EU, I've had many talks with, we've had conversations with the Russians, with Turkey, with the Ukraine, with countries in North Africa that say, okay, please tell us, we want to continue trading with you, but so tell us, what are the requirements? What do you expect from us? How can we accelerate our decarbonization? How can we connect with the energy union that we have in Europe? Ukraine wants to do that, Turkey wants to do that, and this is something quite positive. So the reaction of a lot of countries is not, oh, this is not something we want to see. No, they tell us, okay, what are the requirements and how can we still get access to the European market, which is, by the way, one of the largest consumer markets in the world, if you look at total output. So if you are, let's say you sell oranges, let's stick with oranges, and someone takes away 2/3 of your market, nobody would be happy. Of course, you want to talk to those people and say, okay, please tell me, how can I get access to that market? And this is a very strong thing. We should not underestimate this. Everyone, whatever you produce in the world, wants to sell their products in the US and in the EU. Well, if that's true, let's have conditions. No child labor. treat people in a decent way, good salaries or decent salaries. Let's look at the rule of law. How can we use trade to get rid of autocrats instead of enabling to stay there? I mean, these are things we have to reassess. And if it's up to me, we do that together. You know, the coalition of the willing. Let's show leadership and resolve, as Senator McCain used to say. I think this is very important for all of us.
So carbon pricing would be a very good way to compare apples to apples.
Yes.
A emissions trading system like EU has is easy to compare because that's what you have. If push comes to shove, would carbon intensity calculations by industry or by economy factor into the equation?
I think whatever I think it would be good if also in the US you would have an explicit carbon price, because we need to put a price on pollution. Polluting is something that there is a price that we pay at the end. So whether a company pays for it or we as society, at the end of the day, someone has to pay to get rid of the pollution. But even without that, we need to understand, can we set standards? We are currently in negotiations with the US on the steel and aluminium. We want to set standards there. This would create a beautiful blueprint to go to other sectors. For example, hydrogen, green hydrogen, that's coming up, that will become very important. This is very important. Second thing, if we can have some kind of agreement, how to calculate the carbon footprint. If we would have an agreement between the EU and US, bam, you set an international standard. Because if we agree something, others will follow. And I think these 2 points, so a standard, having benchmarks per product or a standard per product, and an agreement on how to calculate the content of, or the footprint of carbon, these two will already bring us a way forward than we are today.
And to Mohammed's point about the bipartisanship that we see on the stage here, Bill, how do you feel this carbon border adjustment issue, what do you think it has for promise by way of bipartisanship and legislation? Are you finding willing ears in your caucus?
Yeah, I think so. First, let me just emphasize a point. The United States is already ahead of most other countries, including those in Europe. Again, the substitution of natural gas for coal has lowered absolute emissions in the United States to a point roughly the same as 1992. Despite a much bigger economy, more oil and gas production, many more people, our emissions are at a 1992 level. So first, we've got some good stuff. I'll also point out that Republicans under the previous administration were the ones that were pushing for 45QS, which incentivizes the sequestration of carbon. In the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which I had a role in, there is strong encouragement for so-called blue hydrogen, taking natural gas to make hydrogen, but then sequestering the carbon afterwards. And so Republicans have, frankly, just funded in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which we all did, but it actually funded initiatives that began under the Trump administration, when Republicans were in control of the Senate and the House. So, or at least of the Senate. So we can say that we, on the Republican side, have committed to this. Now, always devil's in the details. We've got to work those out.
Yeah.
But conceptually, we've already made great strides. And last, let me just mention this as well. Strong production of natural gas is why we have been able to lower our carbon footprint in the U.S., and it contributes to lowering the carbon footprint worldwide. The absence of natural gas because of the conflict with Russia is forcing Germans, for example, to burn more coal, which means emissions are going to explode. So natural gas, which the U.S. is a leader in, helps us, it helps others. There's a lot of things that Republicans support that helps us and helps others.
So just to put a pin on the point that Bill was making, if we get into this contest over carbon border adjustment, we are getting into a contest that we are virtually destined to win because we start from such a position of advantage. So you can be pretty enthusiastic about American patriotism when we're stepping into competitions we're likely to win. I'll let my colleagues here have a final word, but I would like to wrap up what I have to say here by pointing out that I think we're at a really important moment to try to get this right. And we have the chance, and it begins with the EU holding our feet to the fire by sticking with their CBAM.
I will.
Because if Catherine Tai or John Kerry or President Biden or some other group comes and says, give us a break, let's postpone, let's delay, let's give us a waiver, we want an exception. No, you got to hold our feet to the fire. And then we're forced into this competition in which we are very likely to win. And the ideal outcome here is that rather than just sit there and be forced into that competition, we actually then step up, and there's a further set of negotiations between the EU and the US and Canada so that we regularize a common carbon pricing mechanism, and our common border adjustment is zero, because we're all doing the same thing together, and this becomes climate change NATO.
Yes.
And we are all together, and it's incredibly efficient amongst our economies, and it forces every other economy in the world, China, India, you name it, to compete on our level and to raise their games in a way that nothing else will motivate them to do. And that, I think, is a key on our pathway to climate safety.
Can I
And
say
last words from both of you, and then we'll...
Let me say two things. One of the things is that I think this race is a race that we only win if everyone finishes. So we have to start thinking in collaboration instead of only thinking about the individual perspective. And there's this Dutch saying I would love to share with you, where we say that alone you go fast, but together you go further. And I think if we start working together, we can go very far.
And I would add, this is a policy that of course benefits the environment, but would benefit American business, American workers, and US and EU geopolitical standing. And there is a point, a catalytic point, that has been brought not only by Putin's war in the Ukraine, exposing the vulnerability of other countries to Russian energy supplies, but the understanding that China is looking at Taiwan, and that we need to have a united front that is able to put the brakes upon Chinese military expansion. And having a border carbon adjustment as we're describing, we want China to grow economically, but the pell-mell growth they've had has allowed a great expansion of their militarism. If we level that playing field, improving our economy and moderating their growth just a bit, has the ability to make the world a more peaceful place. And I would argue that this tool should be understood by all of us through that prism.
And it will peel back the fossil-fueled ambitions of Vladimir Putin as well, assuming he's even around for that moment. But we are running out of time. Let me thank you all for your attention. I think we're at an inflection point where very, very big things can happen. And if you could please give a hand to the two doctors, Dr. Chahim and Dr. Cassidy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.